Hello, everyone. This is Parrish Alford with the Daily Journal. I'm joined by Logan Lowery, our Mississippi State beat writer, and special guest, David Brandt of the Associated Press in Mississippi. This is double coverage, a production of the Daily Journal for the next half hour or so. We're going to talk all things Mississippi State and Ole Miss and maybe even some big picture stuff with Dave. Dave, how are you, man?
Doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for being with us. And Logan, you doing okay?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's me and David's favorite time of the year. It's baseball playoff season.
I stayed up way too late for that Cubs-Rockies game the other night.
It was really good, though, wasn't it?
That was a really good game. It dragged me in, and I stayed up the entire 13 innings.
I did too.
Cubs,
yeah,
man. Yeah, the Cubs, they like lead the division the whole time, then they get tied, and boom, boom, they lose 2 games at home in 2 days, and it's over.
Yeah, it's the weird. Baseball is the weirdest juxtaposition like that because it's a 162 game season. It takes forever. There's so many games, and then it can be over almost instantaneously. And I used to really not be a fan of that 1 game wild card, but I got to admit, after a few years now, the drama of it and the way it rewards you for winning the division, I think it's a pretty cool thing, actually.
Yeah, and it's cool when you see those wild card teams make a run all the way to the World Series, just kind of come out of nowhere. Where but as year before, there was no chance of that happening. You had to win to make the playoffs.
Hey, folks, I will let you know that David Brandt is an authority on baseball because he used to retire hitters with an 81-mile-an-hour fastball at Truman State. Google it, Division II, I believe. Is that right, Dave?
That's right. 81 miles per hour is probably a little generous on most days, but yeah, and I only sometimes did I actually retire many people either. But yeah, I played. It was fun. So it was, got to play 4 more years, up until I was 22. And so I really enjoyed it.
And he had a 1,000 winning percentage as a college coach.
That's right. That's my claim to fame. 1-0 as a college coach. Our head coach got kicked out of a game when I was a senior and led the team to glory against Iowa Wesleyan. So there you go. Little fun fact. I could give you the full story, but it might be a little PG-13 A and B. I don't know if we have time here on double coverage.
That's right. Hey, folks, we're going to move on to some football a little bit. Wanted to talk some big picture stuff with David Brandt because he covers all of Mississippi. Dave, you've seen the Bulldogs, you've seen the Rebels. Kind of barreling toward that Egg Bowl coming up on Thanksgiving night. What is your take on these teams right now?
Well, I think that especially with Ole Miss, they are kind of who we thought they are. They're at times they've been very good offensively. They've got some really good receivers, a good quarterback. The offensive line has been pretty good at times. Obviously, against Alabama, against LSU, there's been some tough sledding, but those are top 5 teams right there. And so I think it's a team that's good offensively. It's a team that obviously has a lot of work to do defensively and really is struggling to find answers on that side of the ball. I think State is also a work in progress just because I think with a new football coach comes new challenges and trying to get your new offense worked in and everything. I think they've got an elite defense. Jeffrey Simmons, Montez Sweat, those guys have been just as good as everybody thought. I think on that side of the ball, they might be a top 10 team nationally. Offensively, they're still figuring things out, and that's obviously why they've lost to Kentucky and Florida. So I think with State, there's still some hope that over the next 6 weeks or so, you could turn into kind of an elite team. Whereas with Ole Miss, I think we kind of know what they are at this point. So I think State has a higher ceiling with a couple months left in the season.
All right, I want to hear from both of you guys in a moment on the atmosphere last week in Starkville, Mississippi State, Florida, Dan Mullen, and all that. Before we get there, let me just set the table and say that the Bulldogs are at home again this week against Auburn. That is at home, isn't it, Logan?
Yeah, home at 6:30 on ESPN2, I believe.
6:30 start. So the Bulldogs are back in the SEC at home against Auburn. Number 8, I believe, this week, Auburn. And the Rebels are back at home as well against Louisiana Monroe, the last non-conference game for Ole Miss, an excellent chance to improve to 4-2. But the Rebels now have got to start proving they can put up some yards and points against the SEC. And as David pointed out, they've played 2 very good SEC teams in Alabama and LSU, but not a lot of consistency on offense in those games where they have been explosive other times. We're going to come back and talk about this week's games in a moment. Again, both of you, let me hear from you. Logan, start us out. What was that atmosphere like? Was it what you expected?
It really was, and just it was probably the loudest I've ever heard that stadium. I mean, it gets loud at several points, especially during that 2014 season when State was going on that run. But yeah, that may be the start of that ball game may have been the loudest I've ever heard it. Yeah, the boos really wasn't as overwhelming towards Dan Mullen as I thought they would be. But as that game progressed and that offense wasn't moving the football, those boos for Dan Mullen quickly turned to new head coach Joe Moorhead, and it was kind of strange to see that happening over the course of that ball game. But I think the fans kind of got fed up with the way that the offense was just not moving the chains.
Yeah, I totally agree. The 2014 Auburn game specifically was the one that I really remember just being incredible. And I think this Florida game this past week was kind of, you could say one was number one or number two. It was close. I mean, they were both amazing atmospheres. So, the atmosphere was electric. And I think that there's been a ton of expectations around this team, and to see them offensively, like Logan say, just be unable to move the ball, unable to convert on third downs. When Osiris Mitchell dropped that pass that would have been a touchdown, you just felt 60,000 people all groan at the same time. You could feel the stadium, just the energy kind of get let out of Davis Wade. And so you're right. I didn't think the boos for Dan Mullen were really any worse than the boos for just about anybody else that would come into the stadium. But it was interesting as the game went on. This is a team, a fan base that really expected, especially on the rosier end, 10 wins, 11 wins, really competing for an SEC title and maybe going into that Alabama game with really something on the line. And right now, instead of winning the SEC, I think fans are, wondering if they're going to win an SEC game. And so I think it's gone from too optimistic to too pessimistic in the span of a week or two. I think these coaches will figure some things out, but certainly there's a lot of angst right now in Starkville.
All right. Why were the boos less for Dan Mullen than expected? Was it because we get too caught up in social media and that's where all the negativity seems to come from? Should we expect that there are many more level-headed fans in Starkville who appreciate what Dan Mullen did for the program in 9 seasons than we thought? What's the take on that? Dave, start us off.
Well, first off, I think there's part of that. I think that there are a lot of fans that are appreciative of Dan Mullen. It's hard to just, bring out the nasty boos for somebody you really respect that led your program for a decade. But I think there's a unique kind of dynamic with the Mississippi State program and just the fan base, and that a lot of times they just ring the cowbells, and that's for any emotion. It can be happy, sad, angry. And so there was a lot of loud cowbells for that. And I think that was sort of in place. So some people booed, but I think the booing was almost drowned out just by the cowbells. So I think that's sort of a dynamic that's unique to Mississippi State and maybe why there weren't quite as many boos.
Yeah. And I agree with David. And two, I thought it was kind of a jab at Dan Mullen when they trotted out Jackie Sherrill during one of those timeouts, and that got a loud ovation, recognizing him as the all-time winningest coach in Mississippi State history, and he finished 6 wins ahead of Dan Mullen, even though it took him twice as long to get to 75 wins, and Dan Mullen's sitting there at 69 wins, and it was just a kind of a quick jab, and I guess a good jab by the marketing department to think ahead, think on their feet, and have that planned out.
It was very subtle. I like that.
Yeah.
Hey, winningest coach is winningest coach, man. You are what your record says you are.
Very true. Didn't Sherrill end up 75 and 75 exactly?
Exactly. 75, 75, and 2, I believe, is what the final record ended up being.
And so the lure of becoming the all-time winningest coach at Mississippi State wasn't enough to keep Mullen around for another year, obviously. Dave, tell us about Ole Miss. You say they are what we thought they are. I agree with that. But, I look at this team and I don't see a chance for it to become much better. I look defensively and I see them moving people in and out along the defensive ends, really along the entire line and linebackers. And, and you hear, well, that's so they'll stay fresh. But I think it's also because they're still trying to identify their best players. And the secondary, the one group where we heard them say deep, where they had depth at the beginning of the season, has become just a terrible situation with 3 starters lost, another one in Ken Webster, a spot starter who has missed a lot of playing time. And all of a sudden you're having to move guys over from the running back position just to fill out the 2 deep. It's hard to imagine them getting a lot better yet. As I look down the schedule, I see Auburn remaining, I see Mississippi State remaining, but I think they could steal some SEC wins against Vanderbilt, Arkansas, maybe a Texas A&M, and again, every one of those games could go the other way. What do you see coming down the road for this team?
Well, I totally agree that especially the situation in the secondary has been really unfortunate for them, because that was one of the spots where, again, they had some guys who had played a lot of football, and it's just kind of fallen apart with the injuries back there. And that's why I've said that I think Mississippi State has a little higher ceiling right now than Ole Miss. I think Mississippi State, if you get that offense, you have people who have done it before, and it looks like that they can get that side of the ball rolling. If you get that going with the defense, suddenly I think you've got a good top 20 team once again. With Ole Miss, I just think that defense is going to be kind of pieced together with bubblegum and scotch tape the rest of the year, and you've just got to hope that offense can outscore some people. You need to win some games 45-38. You need to hope they can do that against Arkansas or Vanderbilt or even Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, because you've got them at home. I mean, you need a couple games like that. So I think with Ole Miss, there's really only one way you can win a game, and that's by outscoring people. I think with State, there's still hope you could get that offense going and, be a pretty balanced team.
All right, Dave, one more question for you, man, and we'll let you go, because we know that you're covering Mississippi for the entire world, man, and just the far reach of Associated Press there. Egg Bowl, who wins it, man? Last year we went into this game in Starkville, and I thought, Mississippi State's heavily favored. A lot of the same storylines this year. Ole Miss wasn't very good defensively. It looked like the Bulldogs were set up to just really run the ball and run away with the game. It didn't work out that way. Obviously, Nick Fitzgerald got injured, and that played a big part in that as well. How do you see this game this season?
A lot of it, I still think, depends on the mood coming in, like where State is regarding their bowl eligibility position. Really, with Ole Miss, we've still got to find out what happens with their appeal. I mean, there's an outside chance they could even be eligible for a bowl. So we've got a couple, determining factors, I think, down the line. But today, I think if the Egg Bowl were played, even though it's in Oxford, I think Mississippi State wins that game. I still think they've got one side of the ball that's truly elite. I think that defensive line is really good. The linebackers have been solid with Errol Thompson, Gary Green. Again, the secondary, that's just a complete unit. I think that Ole Miss hasn't shown that they can score against a defense that is that good. And so I see Mississippi State winning in the 27-17 range, something like that. But again, I think there's a lot to be determined about where these teams are mentally in 6 or 7 weeks.
Dave, thanks a lot for being with us, man. Go out and work on that knuckleball, I guess. All
right, well, that'll have to be for the comeback, because sheer velocity is not coming anytime soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right, take care, guys. Thanks a lot.
All right, Logan, let's talk about a little more specifically about these games. Looking back a little bit at Ole Miss, I think the biggest concern right now for this team moving forward from an offensive perspective, and offense was, I think, where everyone focused after a 45-16 loss to LSU, because, again, the defense, you know what you have. But there's a disturbing trend right now, even though they were great defenses, that this offense hasn't been able to put up very many points in their 2 SEC games. In fact, going back and adding it up, they've been outscored by Alabama and LSU 45-16 to LSU, but the combined total of Alabama and LSU is 107-23. I mean, that's a big gap there. And I can't tell you that the rest of the SEC is just going to be that much weaker. You've got to begin to establish yourself against the rest of the conference. And obviously they're not going to get a chance to do that this week. ULM, Louisiana Monroe, will have a fair team, Logan. There have been times when I've seen the alma mater come through and I've said, these guys have no chance. Well, that's not how it is this time. They've got a quarterback in Caleb Evans who can run. Ole Miss didn't guard Joe Burrow very well, gave up a lot of quarterback run yards there. They've got a capable offense. They'll be able to put up some points. It'll be a competitive game. I think it could be one the Rebels pull away from late, kind of like Kent State. But this is a team that really needs to find some confidence against the rest of the conference. And looking past the ULM game, which again is their final non-conference game, they very well could be 4-2 and could be the most discontent 4-2 fan base in the country. But after ULM, they take on Arkansas and Little Rock. And while the record is not impressive, and Arkansas will be 1-5 after they lose to Alabama this weekend, they've shown a pulse. They competed against Texas A&M. That was a 24-17 game after the Aggies were up 14-0 early. Arkansas has done some good things defensively. There's just not a game on the schedule in conference or out of conference that Ole Miss can take for granted. So where does this improvement come from offensively? I think what we saw against LSU in the passing game was an isolated incident and not a trend. We saw receivers drop passes. We saw Tiamu off the mark with his throws. Against Alabama, I attributed that to pressure. He was constantly on the move and sacked 5 times. And, they got in his head. And they hit him hard, too, when he took off down the field and ran for a first down. Just 2 guys just really popped him and he fumbled. That was in the first half. And, so I think Alabama had a lot to do with his inaccuracy in that game. That wasn't the case against LSU. And, of course, he was on the mark as well. But at the end of the day, he was 50%. He's got to complete a much higher percentage than that. And we saw drops from all 3 of the starting receivers, and that's something that we had not seen. I don't think that's going to continue. But, again, these guys have got to be able to click for Ole Miss to have a chance to win games. One of the talking points this week, Logan, for the Rebels has been the running game. It has been very effective. And Scotty Phillips, who was a question mark at the beginning of the season, Rebels trying to replace a 1,000-yard rusher in Jordan Wilkins, bringing in a junior college transfer, first year in the SEC. Guy's been really good. He's shown a burst of speed that's helped him break some big runs once he's gotten to the second level. He's shown good vision, shown the ability to cut and move. 96 yards on 16 carries against LSU, and a lot of people felt like the Rebels got away from the run, when the passing game was not in sync like it has been. Feel like a lot of people felt like they could have given more attention to the run, and they didn't. Phil Longo during the week, the offensive coordinator earlier this week, standing by his gun saying, look, we're going to take what the defense gives us. This is based on quarterback reads. We're not going to run into numbers, as he said. And basically, you got Matt Luke supporting him saying, hey, we see Scotty's yards per carry, but a lot of that is due to the fact that he's running into good looks. And, that's what they base this offense on. My question is, when the rest of the offense is not there, when you're not getting the first downs, moving the chains, do you force the issue with the run a little bit? Do you do something more, to get more carries for Scotty Phillips? And, that's a question that they're going to have to answer. And right now the answer is no, not going to run into numbers, not going to do anything different with the run game. It's still going to be very much a take what the defense gives and based on the quarterback reads. And I believe, Logan, you're hearing some of the same things about the Joe Moorhead offense there this week as well.
That's exactly a lot of the things that you just said is some of the things that I've heard here. Mississippi State's running backs, Colin Hill and Eris Williams, have both ran the ball really well this season. And even in these losses, they've ran the ball well. But you take last week's game, for example, Colin Hill and Eris Williams got 12 combined carries for like 72 yards. They're both this season. Colin Hill is averaging 7.7 yards per carry. Eris Williams is averaging 7 yards a carry. Those guys are running the ball effectively. They're just not getting enough carries. And a lot of that, Joe Moorhead said, is based on the run pass option offense that he's running, and the quarterback is reading the defense. And when the running back is getting the ball, it's in advantageous situations. It's always good for the offense when the running back does get the ball, because that's what the quarterback is reading, what the defense gives them. But this week he said, he acknowledged that. He's like, we've got to find ways to get the ball in the stomach of the running back, and he's going to call more design runs in an effort to try to do that, to take that option out of the quarterback's head. And he said he thought that Dick Fitzgerald has made the right reads up until this point, but he's going to call more design runs this week, and we'll have to see if that's effective. Obviously, Mississippi State's offense, Parrish, I've never seen an offense go from one extreme to the other like Mississippi State has over the last 3 weeks. The first 3 games, Mississippi State was averaging 587 yards and 50 points per game. They've scored 1 touchdown the last 2 games. They against Kentucky, Mississippi State had 201 yards. Against Florida the last week, they had 202 yards. So they're averaging 201.5 yards the last 2 weeks. And it's just, for whatever reason, they just have gone from one extreme to the other. Just, an explosive offense putting up against Louisiana Lafayette. Now, granted, those first 3 opponents weren't any kind of juggernaut or anything like that, but you wouldn't think you'd see a drop off to that extent, like State has had the last 2 weeks. But against Louisiana Lafayette, State scored touchdowns on its first 7 drives. I mean, that offense was clicking, and then they go to Kentucky, and Kentucky found a weak spot in State's offense in those offensive tackles. They started lining up their Josh Allen, their speed rush end, outside the tackle, and they just were just running around State's offensive tackles and getting pressure on Fitzgerald, and got him rattled a little bit. And he wasn't able to throw the ball effectively. He wasn't able to run the ball effectively. And Florida followed suit with that last week. Florida had 6 sacks in that ball game. State's given up 9 sacks the last 2 weeks, and most of that's come off the edges. And they've got to figure out a way to get that offense back in sync. And just like David Brandt was saying earlier, that drop by Osiris Mitchell just deflated that entire stadium, and State sideline included. State's leading 6-3 at halftime. It's been an offensive struggle. Florida gets the ball back to start the second half. Mississippi State gets an interception and returns it to midfield. Place is going ballistic. Finally something positive has happened. State gets the ball back at midfield, and Joe Moorhead immediately calls that shot. Osiris Mitchell runs a post pattern. He gets in front of his man. Nick Fitzgerald could not have thrown a better pass. It's 6 points, but Osiris Mitchell just drops it. State ends up going 3 and out on that drive. And then Florida gets the ball back, drives down there, runs the trick play, and scores the game's only touchdown. And at that point, I mean, it was, still early in the third quarter, but you felt like the game was over at that point, because Mississippi State's offense had done nothing to that point, and didn't do anything from that point. It was just that's how bad it's been, and I just didn't see it coming.
I just think, Logan, and we see this every year, it takes more than one game. It takes more than 2 games. It takes a long time before you really begin to see what you have in these teams. Across college football, that's just the way it is. When you're playing a team like Louisiana Lafayette, Stephen F. Austin, and things like that, the only thing you can do is execute your offense and play against yourself. That's the only way you can measure what you are accomplishing. And State did that. They executed at a high level, and and they scored a lot of points, got a lot of yards, but it's hard to get a read on the team when that's the level of competition. That Kansas State game 2 years ago looked like a really attractive game, but there's just Kansas State is struggling right now, obviously. All right. So State goes and executes its offense, but it just takes weeks until you get into the meat of the schedule and they begin to see better defenses and SEC athletes. But like you, I am surprised by the level of struggle that we've seen from them in 2 games. I think Kentucky's better. I think Kentucky 2 weeks ago wasn't getting a lot of credit. I think that's beginning to change. Ole Miss, it's the same thing. People looked at that Texas Tech game on the schedule and thought, 2 middling teams. This is just going to be mediocre football. I thought Ole Miss played well in that game. Unfortunately, I think it's been their best game of the year. And that's against a team that after that opening day rose up into the top 25 until they lost to West Virginia. They've played good football. They've got some injury issues going on now. And again, you look at Ole Miss now as compared to then, and there are 3 starters in the secondary that the Rebels no longer have. So all of this, compiles, and it's only then that you really get a better read on these teams. We've seen Ole Miss be explosive offensively against non-conference teams. Logan, my take on that is if you can make an over-the-shoulder catch when you've got a deceiver, when you've got a receiver being guarded so closely by the defender, when the defender's right there, I mean, that's a catch that you ought to be able to make in SEC play as well. Now that SEC athlete might be able to get a hand up there, but not all the time. You can make those catches in the non-conference. You ought to be able to make a few more catches in your conference games as well. So that's what has to happen for Ole Miss. Look, I don't think they're about to do what Joe Moorhead says he's going to do and start just handing off a lot more to Scotty Phillips. I don't think you're going to see very many more designed runs for Phillips. To the contrary, Phil Longo's comments earlier in the week were along the lines of, hey, I've got to do more to let these receivers create space. So that's where his thinking is, and that's where Ole Miss's talent is. That's where the bulk of their talent is. Scotty Phillips has been a really good find, and at 7.22 yards per carry, he's been very productive. But look, there is an abundance of talent at wide receiver. You've got a quarterback who can get him the ball most of the time. You've got an offensive line that has protected well, has given up some sacks, but they pass it almost every play. They're going to give up some sacks. That's where the focus needs to be, but you can't forget that running game, and sometimes you might have to force the issue a little bit or become creative with the way you get Scotty Phillips in open space as well. Folks, that's it for this edition of Double Coverage, a production of the Daily Journal. We thank you for being with us, and with our special guest, David Brandt, earlier in the program. Folks, remember, we're here every week. Come back and join us again next week.